Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to continue with the technocratic theme and the different structures within this technocracy system that are being developed. Well, the idea has been around already, but there are certain newer or more recent technologies that they want to incorporate into their system. A system of supposedly making the governance of a society more efficient, and the use of these more recent technologies is supposed to help in that aspect. But there are also dangers to this program, and there are also nefarious, what you could argue are nefarious reasons behind wanting a technocratic system where so-called experts are in charge and there's no democracy anymore, where people are not elected. Instead, people are selected due to their so-called technocratic skills to run all the departments of government. Although technocrats are used in the current system by elected politicians, they turn to technocrats for more information or more expertise on particular areas of governance. A technocratic system won't have elected politicians. What they'll have is just experts running the system. So anyway, I'll start by looking at, because I'm talking about digital IDs as I mentioned, but I'm looking at the different areas of what this digital ID system means, or also the different forms of technology that are used in digital IDs, and some that they want to bring in. And I'm looking at the different dangers of surveillance and monitoring of people, and the dangers of people's privacy being lost, and how people will be what you might call punished because of they're being surveilled so much that they can determine that you have done certain things which go against what this state defines as good behavior, and therefore you face some kind of punishment for that. Due to the level of surveillance that they have over you, they can monitor what you're doing and then make decisions about your life. But anyway, let's look at the types of ID, the types of ID. An issued ID includes state or national issued identification like birth certificates, driver's licenses, and systems such as India's biometric ID system. Anyway, a de facto ID. So the issued IDs are the ones that you move around with and show when you need to show your ID. The de facto ID is an emerging category of ID that is formed through data trails that people leave behind when using digital services, including credit scoring based on mobile phone use or social media use. So this de facto ID is somewhat outside of an individual's control. It is often used based on analysis of passive data for which individuals are not given consent to collect or use in this way. This ID also includes situations where refugees are tracked via cell phone data records. So this de facto ID is a new and complex way of being identified and categorized. So this de facto ID is basically everything that you do online, maybe not even online, also in your daily life, builds a picture of the type of person you are, where you go, what you do, what you eat, and the type of work you do. So it's basically a de facto ID is basically an image or a picture of the type of person you are and what you do. And the self-asserted ID, this is the third one, is linked to the decentralization of ID system. It is based on the possession of forms of ID that prove who we are, that we manage ourselves. A related term is self-managed ID, which is recognized. There is no ID that is self-asserted, because our identity is relational and always relies on others recognizing us as who we are and who we believe ourselves to be. So self-ID could be an impression of the world that you want the world to see, even though within this so-called technocratic system, they will have their own impression of what you are and what you do based on all the information they collect about you. But a self-managed ID is an ID that you want to, an impression that you want to give to people of who you are. So, looking at the evolving structure of these new technologies, you have the different processes of authentication. That's the process that determines if authenticators use. It's a system of how you verify who a person is through fingerprint, passwords. Those are two other things they mention here, but there are others that I'll be mentioning later on. Then there's your profile, which includes inherent data attributes such as biometrics, or assigned attributes such as names or national identifier numbers. So that's your tax number, your TIN number, or your national ID number, something like that. And history, credit records, medical histories, online purchasing behavior, and then inferences, judgments or decisions made based on authentication processes, profiles, and histories, i.e. a bank decides the attractiveness of an individual for a loan based on your credit record and your spending habits and your saving habits. So the inference is based on your records of your financial behavior, for example. And then the history, which comes before inferences, is your credit or medical histories that leads to the decisions they make as to whether they can give you a loan or not. Or if a social credit system like China, whether you can benefit socially, having access to certain services because you're behaving well. That's definition basic of what IDs are. But now I'm going to look at the different forms of identification and authentication technologies. I think I briefly mentioned what the dangers of some of these are. Yeah, basically. So the biometrics, what they talk about when I mean biometrics is things like fingerprint, facial recognition, vascular. They have technology which can map the veins in your arms or your hands, and each individual has a different formation of veins in their hands, so they can use it like a fingerprint or facial recognition technology. Then iris recognition, again, that's also something your retinas have different formations, which are all unique to each individual. Then your voice, then behavioral recognition, the way you behave online, the way you behave online basically is also a form of recognizing who a person is. Then obviously the last one is your DNA. Everyone's DNA is unique to a certain extent. Then in terms of the cards that we already know, like we have contact smart cards. These are like credit cards and so forth. Then contactless smart cards. These are cards which don't necessarily have any kind of magnetic strip or chip inside of it. It's like an ID card that you present when you go to a venue. And then you have barcodes, magnetic stripes, which are on credit cards and things like that. So those are some of the technologies that they use. Then in terms of mobile phones, you have OTP, smart IDs, which is one of the things that are coming in. In the UK, they're talking about having this new digital ID using a smartphone, so some kind of software which you can use to identify yourself when you're using certain services or looking for work or something like, or claiming benefits in the UK. But they've also brought those things into other countries, which I'll mention in a while. So those are some of the technologies that they're using to identify, and some of the ones that we already use. But the biometrics, I think, will be more incorporated into this digital ID system. And these are the technologies that will become more common. So instead of presenting a card or something when you go to a venue, they'll identify you through your fingerprint your facial recognition or your iris or something like that. So anyway, looking at the process, I'm going through a general idea of how this digital ID system works. So I've looked at some of the technologies, or the main technologies that they're going to use. Then there'll also be, this is the process where you first is to, you provide your biometric data, fingerprints and so forth to the system. And then after that you're issued with some kind of card or some kind of credential, which was most likely a card. After successful identity proofing, an official ID or credential is issued based on the information that you have given. So you give your fingerprint, your retina scan, even your vascular scan. That's the other one I wanted to mention. You get these, you get these types of scan, then they issue your card, which would normally have some kind of electromagnetic record of this information. The next stage is identity authentication. So you produce your official ID at a government hospital or whichever service you want to use. And then additional modalities like face and iris are captured for someone as per the new government guidelines. So this is the management of the ID system, is where they may want to update the ID system so that they can use other forms of identifying you in your day-to-day use of services. Here I'm going to, there's several areas in which digital ID is connected to into society, which incorporate some of the dangers that people are concerned about. In the UK, for example, recently, where the government says they want to introduce a digital ID, there have been protests and a petition, a government petition where you can fill out online, where almost 3 million people filled out the petition for the government to discuss the issue before they go ahead and implement it. But it seems they've ignored the petition and gone straight ahead and decided that they are going to implement something whereby you're supposed to, if there's people decide they want to protest, because a petition is a form of protest, telling government that you want to, before it goes ahead with a policy, people want the government to discuss that issue before going ahead so that the people can have their say. But if the government decides now it's going to ignore a petition, because a government petition requires 100,000 signatures before it can decide to discuss an issue. But where you receive almost 3 million, which means a good proportion of the society wants that issue discussed, or they're in complaint of that policy, and the government decides now it's going to ignore it. Is that really a democratic society? Anyway, let's look at some of the areas in which digital IDs will be used, or they're either currently used or they'll be used more frequently in the future. There's the financial services, which we already know. That's opening bank accounts or carry out any kind of financial transaction. There's for food, for farmers, consumers to verify provenance of produce to enhance value and traceability in supply chains. But for consumers, purchasing of food in a supermarket, for example, using your credentials, your credit card or whatever, because in the future they're talking about, as I mentioned in previous programs, they're talking about moving away from cash, where all transactions will be made digitally. And they're also talking about this carbon currency and carbon credits as a new form of currency. And obviously that is not cash, that will be online. And to obtain these things, you have to obviously have your digital ID, some kind of digital ID. Then there's travel, booking trips, traveling and so forth. You need your ID to verify who you are before you can pay for your travel. So they can identify somebody through digital ID and to identify where they're going to where they're coming from. Basically, wherever you move to, because of your digital ID, they'll know where you are. E-commerce, that's related to banking and the use of digital ID in business. Then the social platforms, this is social media basically. So what they're looking at, what they're even talking about now, is that people may have to register with their digital ID to use social media. You know, the apps like X, Facebook and so forth that we're currently using in the future. In the near future, they're talking about the fact that people may have to register using some kind of digital ID before they can use the service. So at the moment, you can just register for a service and start using it, even possibly using a false name. But now that you'll have to register using your own ID. So it's another form of tracking who is registered on what particular social media service, and possibly also what they're saying on those platforms. E-government, for citizens to access and use government services like paying taxes, voting, collecting benefits. So even through all your social services that you access, this digital, well, you normally have to use your ID anyway, but now through this digital ID system, they can track you more. And the different services like benefits and taxes and so forth will be more connected, because all these departments are interconnected. So when you travel, the government will be able to track where you go and when you go. When you're collecting benefits, how much money is on your bank account, the government will have access to that through this new digital ID system, and the way they want to interconnect these systems so that everything you do will be almost centralized, so that the government will be fully aware of how you're living your life, or if they perceive that you're trying to cheat the government or you're involved in inappropriate financial activities, they can track what you're doing. In telecommunications, we know that even in more recent years, you have to use your ID now to even purchase a phone or a SIM card. And in terms of smart cities, there's this idea of geofencing, where they can track you and your ID, through your ID, where you are, that if you move beyond a certain area, you'll know they can block your bank account, so you're not able to access your finances, or you're not able to access certain services if you move too far, if you travel to certain areas. At the moment, they're talking about geofencing in terms of if you move to certain areas, you can get certain types of advertisements on your phone, marketing promotions on your phone as you move through, say, a city or from one city to another, depending on, because they already know what your interests are through your online activities. So it's the same way that when you're viewing a website or when you're online, you get or on your phone you get certain types of adverts relating to what you're already interested in because of these website cookies and whatever. So geofencing at the moment is used for that purpose, or they're talking about using it for that purpose, but it can also be used to restrict access to certain services when you move into certain areas, if your behavior is deemed to be negative in certain ways. But anyway, the next area, let me have a look at. This is looking at, there are 2 countries in the world that they're saying that they have the largest digital ID systems. One is in Kenya, the Huduma number system, and the other one is Aadhaar in India. And according to this is a policy document. Hold on, let me see where this document is from. This is it's a document from the EU Parliament. Digital technology as a means of control. So they're questioning how this digital technology will work and how it may be a system of control or a means of control in different societies. The world's two largest digital identification systems are Huduma Namba in Kenya and Aadhaar in India. Among other data, they involve collection of fingerprints, retina and iris patterns, voice patterns, and other identifiers. They determine access to essential government services such as voting, registering birth certificates and civil marriages, or paying taxes, or access to pensions and unemployment benefits. However, there is evidence that when trying to access public services through these systems, certain racial and ethnic minority groups in both countries find that they are excluded, while others face logistical barriers that in effect can result in de facto exclusion from services which they are entitled. Furthermore, people with disabilities have experienced discrimination for not being able to provide fingerprint or iris scans. So that's some of the limitations of the systems. If people, for example, have disabilities, as they say, or those who don't have digital IDs will be excluded from certain services. So that's some of the, but you could almost argue that is a benefit. So yes, you'll be denied the service, but also you'll have certain level of freedom in that you're not being monitored by this online system. If you're living off-grid, as they call it, if you live independent and you're surviving mainly by yourself, then there's no need for you to be part of the system. The use of digital technologies has contributed to the emergence of so-called a digital welfare state in many countries across the globe, a trend considered to provide endless possibilities for taking of surveillance and intrusion to new and deeply problematic heights. This particularly applies to the development of digital identification systems that involve the collection of various forms of biometric data and are used to determine the distribution of social benefits and access to public services. Governments that have been experimenting with incorporating these technologies into their welfare system include India, Kenya, South Africa, Argentina, Bangladesh, Chile, Jamaica, Malaysia, the Philippines, and the United States. So again, they're arguing that these systems have their problems in terms of excluding people who are not registered or don't have a digital ID. So somebody can't just walk into an office and say they want to claim a benefit or a service. If you're not within that system, you can't claim it. But in a humane system, obviously as a human being, you can walk into a place and claim a benefit. If you're a citizen of that country and claim a benefit, even without, now imagine not being able to go to a restaurant, for example, and pay because you have cash but you don't have a digital payments card or something. You don't have a way of paying digitally, but you have the cash. So what do? In a traditional system, even barter trading is possible. You can bring a product and exchange it for another product, but when your methods of payment are now restricted in this so-called modern society that we live, it will be codified in such a way that you have to have certain items or be registered within the system in a particular way before you can access even food. Anyway, this is going on to say Finland introduced the first electronic ID card in 1999. Digital identity systems have played key roles in service provision and public security in more than 130 countries. And the COVID, as we know, talking about this vaccine ID or vaccine certificate they were talking about back in 2020, 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic was a major driver of adoption since it heightened the government's awareness of the benefits of using population-wide data sets for public health responses. According to the United Nations, by 2024, 78% of member countries had enacted legislation or issued policy documents for digital IDs enabling access to public services. So they're saying that 78% of countries, that's over what, 3/4? Yeah, about 3/4 of the United Nations membership, which is what, 190 countries, have began to enact legislation related to national IDs or digital IDs. And these digital IDs in the COVID period, what people were worried about, that if you couldn't prove that you had taken the vaccine, some venues would not allow you to access, or would not be allowed to have certain access to certain services in some countries. If you couldn't prove that you had taken the vaccine, this form of vaccine certificate, this digital certificate, is something that would prove you've taken a vaccine. So this was a form of introducing this digital type of identification during that period. And according to this, that was one of the major factors in bringing in this new system. Maybe the purpose, no, I'll deal with the COVID-19 outbreak in another program as to the real reasons for the outbreak. But right now, I think I'll stick with the digital ID. Just in the last 3 months, China has rolled out a new biometric ID program for online services, and Ethiopia has launched its FIDA digital ID, and Armenia has announced plans to roll out a new biometric ID card system by 2026. So many countries around the world, it seems, are adopting this digital ID system. But there are questions around issues, as I mentioned, surveillance, which I'll mention again in a minute, but there's also issues of human rights and the rights of people within the system. This is a document from, let me have a look where it's from, the same EU Parliament report, an important development responding to one of the most current challenges in the area of AI-powered biometric data collection system is the report by Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty. The rapporteur addresses the emergence of digital identification systems, a problem that so far has been only briefly tackled in human rights legal framework. It describes the negative impact of those systems on privacy, non-discrimination, as well as several social and economic rights, warning against a grave risk of stumbling zombie-like into a digital welfare dystopia. A dystopia system in which people who are not registered can't access certain welfare systems, or if they say the wrong thing or make the wrong criticisms of society, of the government, then they'll be restricted from accessing their welfare, or basically, if you can't access welfare, you can't find places to live, and you can't buy food to eat. You can't get money to buy food to eat. Because one of the other issues that they're talking about is using this digital ID to identify somebody before they can even rent a property or rent an apartment. Moreover, while to date, civil and political rights were under the spotlight of the human rights community, has become clear that a number of social, economic, and cultural rights are also severely affected. Technology-related violations of these rights have become particularly apparent alongside proliferation of digital identity systems in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. In light of these developments, and in line with the holistic approach on social, economic, and cultural rights should be given more prominence in future human rights organization agendas. So basically what he's saying is they're not talking about the digital systems and how it affects human rights as of yet. It's still relatively new and growing. So how these digital ID systems affect human rights is an issue that is growing, but it's not being tackled properly yet. So, in terms of surveillance, I talked about them being able to surveil people before, but there are concerns about this. And this again is another report. Oh, it's within the same report. This report covers some areas relating to the dangers or the risks of the use of digital ID systems. Further, sudden proliferation of pandemic-related apps may contribute to normalization of widespread digital surveillance, especially as many opaque systems of information collect and predictive analytics have been implemented under the guise of emergency measures predictive analytics is about predicting people's behavior. Then you have risk analytics. Risk analytics is used, for example, by Google when you sign into your, say, Google account from a different device from what you normally use. You'll get warnings on your original device about somebody trying to sign in. So the fact that you're using a different device to sign in is kind of predicting that there's a possibility that somebody else is trying to access your account. So anyway, then apart from the expansion of existing surveillance systems, the COVID-19 crisis has also led to the unveiling of many high-tech tools, especially aimed at tackling the pandemic. The most prominent example is a rapid rollout of pandemic-related mobile applications used for contact tracing, quarantine enforcement, social distancing, monitoring or system. All of these are digital ID types of systems. Based on your ID, they're tracking your movements and whether you've been vaccinated or if you have the virus, what are your movements, are you being quarantined? Sometimes combined with a health status code, which such as smartphone apps have been introduced in at least 54 countries across the globe. This is something I didn't know, that they were monitoring people using apps on phones as to whether they've been vaccinated, where they were moving, if they had not been vaccinated. So somebody who was not supposed to be in a particular venue because they've not been vaccinated. I'm not sure what their punishment was if you didn't move beyond certain areas. It doesn't mention that, it just mentioned that people were monitored in their movements. Apps are often closed source, centralized systems and with insufficient cybersecurity standards allowing data to be shared with multiple institutions. This is particularly problematic in the case of repressive regimes where human rights defenders, independent journalists or opposition leaders are routinely targeted. Well, the government, they're going to share the information anyway with certain corporations or different governments. That's what this technocratic global system is all about. The fact that they can monitor you wherever you are in the world, and if you're one of those so-called human rights defenders or independent journalists or independent person who thinks outside of their mindset which they want people to have, then they'll monitor and restrict your movements and restrict your access to services as a form of punishment so that you fall in line. Moreover, in some countries like Singapore, Ukraine and Bahrain, for example, apps have been made mandatory, having a disproportionate and discriminatory impact on certain populations, particularly when non-digital alternatives are not provided. So if there's a non-digital, if you can't access certain services outside the digital scope, then you're going to be in problems, really. Anyway, in countries such as China, India and Turkey, COVID-related health status and contact tracing mobile apps. So these are some of the apps I mentioned earlier. These are some of the countries that were using these apps to monitor people's movements. And they've been used as gatekeepers for access to certain essential public services such as public transport and other public spaces, workplaces or shopping malls. So you couldn't even enter a shopping mall unless you were vaccinated at one time a few years ago, or use public transport based on the app that this digital ID, that app that you are probably forced to use. So, anyway, we continue. Predictive policing. This is a form of one of the uses of this digital ID system. Hold on, this one is from a report, from the same EU report. The Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanction System, or COMPASS system, is a notorious example of an AI system with discriminatory effects. It is There's a scoring tool used in some states in the United States to assess the risk of someone committing a crime with the aim of helping judges to determine whether they should be allowed to go on probation. While the system did not directly consider the racial origin or skin color of the assessed person, a detailed analysis of the results showed that black people were more often rated as risky in terms of committing crime than white people. So this is also one of the problems of this digital ID and AI system in general, or their algorithms, is that their coding or their system is based on information from this European or white-based culture or system that people may be living in, which is already prejudiced against people of color and black people in particular. So the algorithms are based on this. It's almost based on this culture, embedded in the culture is embedded in the algorithms system. So if they have a system which is there to assess whether you're likely to commit a crime or not, or whether you're likely to recommit a crime, based on the bias that's already existing within the system, is going to be prejudiced against black people, in particular, as it mentions here in the US. So these systems are not perfect, which we already know. We already know that there's racism within these AI algorithms, which it seems have not yet been rectified. According to a 2022 USAID report, this is basically saying that 1.1 billion people don't yet have a official digital ID, so they're basically invisible and disconnected from the rest of the world. But that can be a bad thing or it can be a good thing. If you're outside of the system that they're trying to create, this technocratic system that they're trying to create, then you still have some level of independence to operate in the world as a normal human being, you could say, living their life more in a natural environment than a digitally controlled environment. Anyway, without a national identity, these individuals face barriers to accessing public services, exercising voting rights, and in some cases utilizing services offered by the private sector like bank accounts and SIM cards. It's saying that indeed these sustainable SDGs call on UN member states to provide legal identity for all, including free registration at birth, as one means to bridge socio-economic divides. So the UN basically is part of this idea of bringing in this digital ID system where everyone is supposed to be registered. Well, it's good that, in a sense, it sounds positive that everyone can have a digital ID and be able to have access to certain services. But there's also a level of control that comes with this, control and surveillance that comes with this system. So you'll be within a system, yes, you'll have access to certain services, but so also there's a certain monitoring of what you say and do within your own society, which may put restrictions on you being able to access. It may be even something that you say in your private sphere, online, social media, to people that you know, which may end up creating restrictions for you to access certain services which you could normally have access to. But anyway, that's a look at this digital ID system that they're bringing in and many countries are adopting. Anyway, that is it for now.